Shana Tova, and welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast, the first of the Jewish New Year of 5784. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TC Jewfolk, and this week I talk with Ian Rosenthal, the housing justice organizer at Jewish Community Action. We talk about his background in organizing, the harrowing events that helped bring him to this field, and the upcoming Shelter of Justice, a housing justice Sukkot event, September 26th at the state capitol, on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we hear from Ian, programming this week is supported by Temple Israel, inspiring Jewish wisdom to help improve an ever-changing world. They invite you to join them for the remaining High Holy Days and celebrate the Jewish New Year. Membership information and more is available at templeisrael.com/learnmore. And be sure to check out the refreshed TC Jewfolk merch store with newly designed stickers, shirts, hats, and tote bags that help support our mission at Jewfolk and help you look fun and stylish. Check it out at tcjewfolk.com/store. Ian Rosenthal, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure.
So, Ian, you are the housing justice organizer at Jewish Community Action. Do I have the title right?
That is correct.
Tell me a little bit what a housing justice organizer does.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'm still finding it out as I'm finding my feet in this position. I've been on staff at JCA for about, like a year and a half now. And JCA's housing justice program has been a part of the organization since its opening. And I'm following in the footsteps of my predecessor, Aaron Burke, which maybe some of your listeners will already know how amazing he is. But it kind of looks different across different geographies, right? So I facilitate a coalition of autonomous teams across the Hennepin County suburbs called Suburban Hennepin Housing Coalition. I work with those teams to kind of co-strategize, learn how to build collective power, pass progressive housing policies, push for progressive or affordable housing developments. And then in the Twin Cities areas, I work, pretty strongly with JCA's member base to show out in solidarity for the already amazing and dense housing justice work that's going on in Minneapolis. And I haven't actually been onboarded to St. Paul work as of right now, but there are also amazing members in St. Paul that do good work around housing justice as well.
And as you mentioned, the housing justice work that Jewish Community Action does is one of the tentpole functions of the organization in its 28, don't ask me to do math, but roughly between 25 and 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Housing justice has long been, and I know this is something I've talked with Representative Frank Hornstein about,
Mm-hmm.
And with Rachel Breen about over the, two of the founders of the organization. It's something that has been such a massive component to what the organization is all about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's it like to kind of step into that role, knowing how big a piece of the puzzle it is for JCA?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's like incredible and daunting, all at the same time. I think there's an amazing institutional memory at JCA of like the past struggles that we've been involved in and how it's built the current program that I'm involved in. And I'll say that, like, again, as somebody who's a pretty recent transplant to the Twin Cities area, I moved in 2021 from Chicago. That membership base and their experiences and their expertise in what housing justice looks like, what strategies can actually rectify the power imbalances that we see in our housing justice system right now, has been an incredible resource, right? I feel I'm always learning both from the folks who worked prior at JCA and the folks who are amazing membership, right? Dave, our deputy director, is always talking about how JCA's members are special sauce, so to speak. And And so, yeah, it's a major responsibility, right? But it's also an incredible opportunity, and it means that you don't have to do the work alone. You can lean on the folks
Yeah.
who've been involved in the past.
What is it about housing justice work, generally speaking, that you've encountered
Hmm.
that makes it a particularly Jewish issue or fight to be involved in?
Yeah, I think I think as Jews in diaspora, we are constantly tugging at the question of like, what does it mean to make home?
Mm.
Um, what does it mean uh, to try and truly like honor our Jewish values in a system that is out of our hands and that oftentimes displays brutality and violence and displacement. And I think our Jewish texts have a lot to teach us about how we tackle those power dynamics. And I think that like that question, that phrasing of that question, I'm borrowing specifically from the Southside Shtetl, which JCA tabled at most recently, of like how do you make home in diaspora. Um, and I think that we as Jews have a particular perspective based on like the historical dynamics of migration to try and take a cut at that question. So yeah, I think that we have like both a litany of wisdom and texts to draw from in order to try and like make some type of change in the world built up around housing. And our history teaches us that community and community centered housing is both possible and necessary to like culturally actualize.
One of the things that's coming up, the JCA is part of, and again, I have talked to just many people involved at JCA over the years, and one of the things that always comes up is working in coalition with others.
Mhm.
It's something you've mentioned already in some of the Hennepin Housing Coalition work, but there is a sort of Sukkot centered event coming up on Tuesday, September 26th at the Capitol, which is the shelter called Shelter of Justice, Housing Justice Sukkot. I guess tell us a little bit about what that program is and the coalition that helped bring it all together and make it a reality.
Yeah, I'm super excited about this event. So JCA has a longstanding tradition of tying our housing justice work and lifting it up in Sukkot events.
Mm-hmm.
This year, the event kind of emerged out of two relationships. The first is JCA is an active coalition member at the Housing Justice League, which pushes for tenant opportunity to purchase in Minneapolis, which is an amazing policy that would give renters the first right to purchase their building if it ever goes up for sale. And we have an amazing partner at that table, Powderhorn Park Neighborhood Association, that runs a renters fund. So this is like a low barrier emergency rental assistance program that's really different from county funds or other types of emergency rental assistance you might be able to access because it's not means tested, right? It's really super low barrier and super accessible to everybody in Minneapolis. So I was having conversations with Julia there about how JCA might be able to fundraise for that specific pool of money so that we can get some money into the hands of renters who are in need. So this first half of this program for Sukkot is going to be about collecting donations, talking about this program, and collecting donations with folks receiving a really beautiful screen printed shirt or tote bag with original art by a Jewish artist named Sivan Makes. I'm stoked about this design. It is very, very cool. It's a shirt that I would actually want to wear, which I think is kind of a rarity in events. So that's like the first relationship and kind of organizing goal of this event is to raise some good money and get folks some amazing artwork. And then the second half is about a campaign that we're involved in with Minnesota Housing Partnership and a number of other housing organizations called Our Future Starts at Home. And Our Future Starts at Home is a state level campaign that is meant to create a dedicated revenue stream for housing at the state level. It's a constitutional amendment campaign. So rather than being dictated by the whims of a specific budgetary cycle in terms of putting money into affordable housing, right? This would create sustained, permanent funding for affordable housing and progressive housing initiatives year to year in Minnesota. So we're going to have good conversations around that campaign and hopefully get some folks excited about being involved in that constitutional amendment.
I think the idea around a Jewish organization being this tied into housing justice really, having this event that's Sukkot themed with a sukkah on the Capitol steps, like the idea of Sukkot and the impermanence of it really does feel so important in like a modern age to be able to sort of carry that tradition and tie it to something this important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there's just some really fascinating thematic dovetailing of the impermanence of the sukkah in juxtaposition to the permanent funding that we are advocating for housing that really speaks to me. And speaks to the impermanence of the folks who are legislating, right? The Capitol is this fascinating geography of folks who come in to pass policies during like session, and then they leave to go to their local communities who they're representing, right? Um, and thinking about the movement of our policymakers in relationship to, the movement of the way folks are or forced to navigate our current housing system. I think there's just a lot of rich conversations to be had. And it comes back to this idea of like, what do our Jewish texts, what do our Jewish rituals have to teach us about the world that we want to create together in some way, shape, or form?
So how did you, I guess, find your way? I guess we'll end with Minnesota, but how did you find your way to housing justice in general? Was this something that you had always been involved in? Were you a community organizer and this became your niche? How did they all tie together?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've been whittling down my little spiel that I've been giving to JCA members throughout this first year and a half on the job. Why housing for me? It really started, housing as a human right really crystallized for me growing up in Evanston, just north of Chicago, when my family came very close to losing our house during the 2008 housing crisis.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the fiction of the middle class isn't laid bare until you experience a crisis like that. And I think that was a real turning point in my politics in terms of kind of being run of the mill, blue liberal, watches Daily Show with the parents, to being more radicalized. And in terms of like community organizing, I grew up around some very smart people that brought me along in a history of leftism. I attended a college, Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio, that has kind of a long leftist and activist tradition that onboarded me to the project of like wanting to become an organizer. And my foothold in organizing came from employee organizing, and in the publishing sector. And when I moved to Minnesota, I had a change in circumstances in terms of like losing my job based on some employee organizing that I was doing at that current job. And I guess I could get into this story a little bit if we have the time. My partner and I visited Minneapolis many years prior to moving here, and I took a picture of a mural that had JCA's contact information on it over near the U. And so I had been on their email list for however many years before moving here. And I'd say, I don't know, maybe 3 months after losing my job and applying to every organizing position I could see, I got a mass email of the housing organizing job opening up. And I think I applied like the next day. So it was kind of a happy accident in terms of ending up at JCA and ending up in specifically housing organizing. But housing as a human right has always been pretty close to my heart.
Yeah. And obviously it's unfortunate that you had to sort of see firsthand how perilous that can be through sort of that economic crisis we went through in 2008.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tough. I mean, maybe it's undercutting one's own experience, but I think that to come close to losing your home is nowhere near the brutality of folks who actually end up being displaced. And I am constantly relating to and hoping to center the voices of the folks who are most impacted by racial injustice in the housing system and displacement. So I count myself lucky in terms of my upbringing and coming close to that displacement to have an awakening without having to deal with many of the like brutalities of something like that. But you're right. It's really, I think many people, as we know through the Occupy movement and whatnot, were called to some type of politics at that moment in our history in the U.S.
I mean, 2008, that was quite a while ago. I mean, you couldn't have been that old when that happened.
Nope, I am 29. I can hardly remember my age now. But yeah, I was in high school, I think. And
Yeah, 15 years ago, probably, eighth, ninth
yeah,
grade.
I think right. That's about right.
Yeah.
I grew up in the homeschool community, in the unschool community, so I have a
Okay.
tenuous grasp on grades and ages. So I'm always mixing up how old I was whenever. But yeah, I was just old enough to understand like that this was really bad,
Hmm.
and that there were real adult responsibilities that I could wrap my head around while being just young enough to not feel like the agency of getting out of it, I guess you'd say. Um, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that had to be hard to deal with at that age, but also I think it's impressive how it helped inform so much of you and what those next steps look like after having gone through that for you. Obviously, it helped turned into such an important piece of your life and now career at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as kind of you to say. Yeah, I think it's we all have turning points and formative moments, and looking back on it, I'm not grateful for the impact it had on like my parents or my family, but in many
Certainly.
respects, I am grateful for the impact it had on me. I could be a very different and less savory person today had it not been the case.
So was it the opportunity with JCA that brought you to Minnesota, or had you been in Minnesota previously?
No, so yeah, we my partner and I were working remotely during the pandemic. We were living in Chicago at the time. She was an educational support professional in Chicago public school system. I was working in publishing, as I said, and we realized that our relationship to the city had changed pretty drastically. The density and how big Chicago is just didn't feel right anymore. And we had taken this trip to Minneapolis a few years prior to see if we liked it enough to move here. And so we jumped on that opportunity because we had remote work,
Oh,
as
sure.
again, many folks did.
Yep.
And that was in June of 2021, I believe. And yeah, the employee organizing that I was doing in my position kind of came to a head. I'd say like a month after we moved. I was doing organizing the company that I was at distributed some not so good publishers that trafficked in some white nationalist conspiracy theory content.
Ew.
And so the original campaign that I was organizing with folks inside that company was to get the CEO to agree to drop distribution of those publishers, and that kind of came to a head in July, and we pivoted to like conversations about unionizing, and as soon as we did that, I got fired the next day. So
That's
that's
it seemed kind of predictable that a large publisher would maybe do that.
Yes. Yeah. It was not something that I was unprepared for. And is so often the case in labor struggles. So
That is true, but I mean, at least you were in the Twin Cities at that point, and
Mhm.
Aaron deciding to go to rabbinic school
Mm-hmm.
opened
Huge
a
for
door for
me.
you.
Huge
Opened the
for
door
me.
for you. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's exciting work that JCA does, and I do think the event for the Sukkot themed event coming up next week should be really fun, and interesting and informative. And I think the idea, I know we've seen uh a lot over the years recently of constitutional amendment pushes happening here
Mhm,
in Minnesota.
mhm.
So I think this will be another interesting one, gearing up for the 2024 ballot.
Yes, I believe so. But I will say there are folks much smarter and more plugged in than me that might have a different answer for you.
I mean, I think on campaigns like this, though, you need to have people of all talents. You need the organizers, and you need
Yeah.
the political strategists, because it's not just, something like this isn't just, a housing issue. It becomes a political,
Mm-hmm.
it's one of political strategy
Mm-hmm. Yep.
and
Eh,
campaigning. And
Huge. And thinking about the level of state level policy and involving rural voices and specific communities that might have a strategically outsized impact on whether or not something like this gets passed, is yeah, a skill set all in itself to cultivate like a campaign that's going to be successful in that context.
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Ian, last couple questions for you, and we will let you get on with your day. First, what is your favorite Jewish food?
Ooh, I'm gonna sound basic, but I will always stand up for and love my mom's matzo ball soup. Um, I eat it to the extent that it has negative impacts on my health. So yeah, I would say that's my favorite Jewish food
It,
is matzo ball
is
soup.
is there a secret to the recipe, or is it just
For many years, I thought there was,
okay?
until I learned that my mom just uses the Straits matzo meal box recipe. And I think she adds some garlic pepper, which is nice, but she's always talking about the thunk or the thud. I forget which word she uses. She boils the matzo balls and then refrigerates them overnight before she puts them into the broth. And it's got
Okay,
like the perfect density because of it.
interesting.
Mm-hmm. Would highly recommend. Maybe
All
everybody
right.
already does that, but
I when I make matzo ball soup, I do not do that. So
okay.
I like hearing other people's secrets to try to hone my own meal for that for just such an occasion. And what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Oh, that's a good question too. I really like Sukkot. Growing up, I really loved Tu B'Shvat as well. I mean,
Mm,
anything where we're just like throwing down for trees, sign me up.
yep.
Yeah, I'd say those two are probably my top two. And then I love Passover, but have a complicated relationship with usually having been the youngest at the table each year,
Oh, see,
which
you're
is
just getting picked on. Yeah.
exactly. It's a frustrating experience. But now in my adulthood, maybe that's also in the top rotation.
If I was an older child, I wouldn't know that. But although there were several years where I was the youngest of the cousin group,
Mm-hmm.
so that sort of it set me up a little bit for success or failure, depending on how you look at it. Either way,
I mean, you got to experience the euphoria of no longer having that responsibility, which I imagine was pretty sweet.
that was a good time. I didn't hate that. That's for sure. Well, Ian Rosenthal, thank you so much for joining me. We will have links to the event information for what's coming up at the Capitol on the 6th of September. So thank you very much for joining me and chatting more about that and about your story. It was great meeting you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the time and appreciate you, Lonnie.
The Who the Folk podcast is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network and a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.